People always ask what are the killer questions to get a conversation going, which I think is an interesting question in its own right because it assumes that there is some trick or technique that will unlock this, and I don't think there is. But
Hmm.
that said, there are a couple of things which kind of can work. So my favorite ever question was, so,
That's good.
because it implies there is something to be said. We don't like silence very much. I mean, we really don't. And so there's no doubt that sooner or later somebody will say something. And it's quite likely if you ask such an open question, which isn't also a question, it's just a statement, it's a kind of inference, then people will speak that which actually matters to them. So sometimes it's about doing less.
Hello, and welcome to Corporate Culture, your podcast about cooperation and conflict at work. My name is Paul Emtsev, and in this episode, I spoke with Robert Poynton. Robert is a highly experienced facilitator, an associate fellow for executive education at Oxford Business School, and the author of 4 books that I all read with great interest. In his work, Robert focuses on the application of ideas from improvisation to everyday life, the relationship with time, and the everyday miracle of conversations. When Robert is not in Oxford, he lives in an off-grid house in rural Spain with fantastic internet, which gave us the chance to have a wonderful conversation about what good conversations actually are. We talked about the ingredients of real dialogue, the role of questions and responses, and some of the major challenges when talking with each other. Robert shared stories about his work as a facilitator, some of his favorite interventions to spark conversations, and why wearing funky animal slippers will change any board meeting. We also explored how to improvise when facing uncertainty, the role of playfulness in professional settings, and the importance of pause. And along the way, we both realized that good conversations not only depend on what we say, but how we say it. And that we can really practice our capacity to sense what a conversation needs from us and what we need from a conversation. If you are interested in the dynamics behind great conversations or just want to listen to one, I think this episode could be for you. Let's get the conversation started. Here's Corporate Culture with Robert Poynton.
Everybody loves surprises, right? And let's say that you knew exactly what was going to happen in your life. You could predict and control everything. Then where would the delight of finding a satisfying solution arise? It wouldn't, because you already know that you knew. Where
Mhm.
would that chance conversation you have with a bystander that makes you think of something a different way happen? How would you take delight and joy in your children or your partner or your parents? Because you would know everything in advance. And so it's a kind of false god, this idea, this pursuit of certainty. There's a sense in which, yes, we want to reduce uncertainty, but not that much.
Mhm.
And I think that unless we acknowledge that, then we live in this illusion and we spend a lot of time and energy trying to pursue something that, should we be able to succeed in achieving it, would kill us.
Mhm. Mhm.
It would,
Mhm.
it would, it would deprive, as I said in the book, I think that wouldn't be anything we recognize as a life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there are certain kinds of people who hold greater store by prediction and certainty, but they're not normally the kind of people that we warm to. It's the sort of nerd archetype or stereotype. And different people have different needs. And of course, different people have different needs for control and certainty, or think they do, in different aspects of their lives. So I've spent many years working with people who on stage in the theatre are very accomplished at responding to change, unpredictable circumstances, and so on.
On stage or in
On
real life as well.
stage.
Okay.
Well, that's the point. Is on stage, they can be highly accomplished at that. And many of them off stage are frankly control freaky.
Mm.
And the unusual ones are those that actually, and these are the ones I tend to end up working with, particularly Gary Hirsch, who I run a business with or ran a business with, are those that actually are interested in taking that into their lives off stage and thinking, hang on a minute, what can we learn from this laboratory, which is how I think of the improv theatre, into
Hmm.
everyday life.
Hmm.
So yeah, context matters, but one way or another, if everything were certain, there would be no life, and
Yeah.
even Charles Darwin said that, he said those that have survived are the ones that have been able to adapt and improvise most effectively.
Mm.
And the whole field of epigenetics is adding a new layer to that because what we find is that isn't only affecting an organism's ability to survive and reproduce, but actually the lived experience has an effect in some way that I don't really understand, but I'm told by scientists it does on how genes are expressed. And so, not that Lamarck was right that giraffes get long necks by stretching up to reach distant leaves, but that what we do with our lives actually does kind of affect, what we pass on and how we live. So, so that all of biology is kind of living with uncertainty and exploring a
Hmm.
possibility space, if you like, is one way of
Yeah.
what evolution is doing.
Right, right. You know what you said about uncertainty? I was thinking about this question sometimes. I mean, you surely had this question once in your life as well. Is that if you met a magician who tells you how your life will end, or how you will
Mm.
die, or what will happen in 10 or 20 years, right? Would you like to know or not? And I'm always on the side of not wanting to know.
Yeah.
But there are also some people who actually want to know. And I think it connects very well to your to what you said before, right? That maybe if we know too much about the future or too certain about things that will happen or are happening now, maybe life will become less interesting, more boring.
Yeah, I think so. If you take it to that extreme, I think the time to ask the question would not be before you make the choice, but once you've made the choice, in this putative example of the
Mm.
magician. So the question I'd be interested in is somebody who chooses to know
Hmm.
in that example, if that then once they've made that choice and say, and now are you happy that you know?
Ah, yeah.
Because I think that's the payoff, right? Like I sat in a room in California once where somebody said, who would like to go to Mars? And of the 5,000 people in the audience, about 2,000 people raised their hands.
Really?
Yeah. Now,
So many people.
if you'd have said, who would like to go to a radioactive toxic waste dump? Nobody would have raised their hands. That's what Mars is.
Hmm.
So the people who were raising their hands weren't raising their hands because they wanted to go to the planet Mars. They were raising their hand because it was like a cool thing to say in a Singularity University conference in California, and nobody's really thought about what it would mean. And I think the people that would answer, yes, I want to know what's going to happen to me, are kind of under the same kind of illusion.
Hmm.
They think they want to know because they struggle with not knowing. But my question would be, okay, here's the golden gift. You now know. Are you glad you know?
Hmm.
Because if you really did, then there would be no life to be lived. It would be, as
Yeah.
Margaret says, waiting for the train. And anyway, the whole thing is totally theoretical in the way that these philosophical debates are, is this that's not going to happen. There is no
Hmm.
way that anybody, if all of us are able to control or determine very much less than we think we are.
Hmm.
And yet we do perfectly fine most of the time. So to me, it's a much more interesting question. Given that we can't control things, we can influence them, we can shape them, we can have a hand in them. Yes, that's the bit I'm interested in. Given that we can't determine how things unfold, where is it meaningful and intelligent, and what are the meaningful and intelligent behaviors in order to craft, shape, have a hand in,
Mm.
what happens to us, what happens around us, what we can make come to be, all those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably a good training ground is also to have conversations, right? Because, in my opinion, good conversations are the ones you also described before, where you don't know what's going to happen, right? So it's not scripted like we talk now. It's not really a scripted interview where I ask questions, you have answers. I mean, I prepared some questions, but they're already they're already gone.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
so now we're in a real conversation, and I think a real conversation is also something where you play with uncertainty, right? Because you both don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how I will react to your answer, and I also don't know your answer. And my next question is also, I mean, it's a whole game with uncertainty, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's certainly how I think of conversation. And I've written a book about this.
Hmm.
And when I set out to write that book, what I was flabbergasted by is that is not how many people think of conversation. And
Hmm.
even in the field of sociology, the specialist field called conversational analysis, many people seem to regard conversation as a means of transmission of information. And so it does depend what your model of conversation is. I'm absolutely with you. I think a good conversation is one where something arises between the people in the conversation, where they don't know what's going to happen, where it's symbiotic in the sense that they arrive or discover things or uncover things that neither of them would have thought of that way or knew, even if factual information is being transferred, that together they're confecting something, that's a
Hmm.
creative act, and creativity by definition involves uncertainty because to create something that wasn't there before, if you knew what you were going to create precisely, then it would already be there. So you're absolutely right. And I think that's the joy and the delight, and as I say, the kind of everyday miracle of conversation,
Hmm.
that actually, when you stop to think what's going on, it's insane that we can do it at all. And this came out of reading relatively widely about what people have written about conversation before. And what's interesting is there is a kind of widespread lament. It's generally assumed, and not just at this point in time by sociologists, but back in the 19th century, 18th century, as far back as 2000 years ago with Plato, that conversation is a dying art, you know.
Hmm.
And yet here we are,
Hmm.
and the podcast world is a huge explosion of conversation of different kinds with different people. So yeah, I think absolutely conversation is a way that we kind of discover who we are, that we create relationships, that we build ideas. We do so much with it. And yet we're so good at it uh, that we don't really notice. Because and this is why I think your concept of conversation does matter. So if you think it's about faithfully transmitting information, then it's very easy to find it failing.
Hmm.
But if it's a sort of creative, social, collective act, it's a way of making meaning together. It's a way of relating to the world and relating to each other. Then, like I say, I just think it's absolutely extraordinary. The
Hmm.
least extraordinary thing about this conversation is that it's happening via technology. Not because the technology isn't amazing, which it is, but because the kind of behavior that two human beings are engaging in when they're engaging in a real lively conversation is exponentially orders of magnitude greater in terms of its complexity than the
Hmm.
mere technology that transmits it over the internet. The fact that we can respond to, the tone, the mood, the inflection, that the associations and tangents and connections are occurring to us the whole time, that I'm decoding everything about how you're moving, how you're looking. If I'm physically with you, there's a lot more information in that respect. And we're able to do all that without really kind of thinking about it. And we do it as a matter of course, and it's extraordinary. I mean, it shouldn't really
Hmm.
work, it shouldn't really work at all. you know.
Yeah, it's
And if you want to kind of to think about all those extra dimensions of it, if you take a conversation down and write it down, and these days this is an experience we have quite frequently because AI can do that for us. It will transcribe a
Hmm.
conversation, and you see how kind of long-winded and cumbersome it looks once the words are written down, and what a different experience reading that is to having the conversation. And so there's something that's going on a human level that's not about the language. Writing and speaking together are kind of different things,
Hmm.
and I think that the human capacity for dialogue is actually something which is not just kind of satisfying and enjoyable, but actually kind of really important to our capacity to navigate, this incredibly complex, very kind of brutal reality we seem to be living in. Because
Yeah.
if people can't talk to each other, if
Hmm.
people can't bridge the divide, if people can't hear and understand different points of view without either having to agree with them or disagree with them, where's our capacity to deal with, the myriad
Hmm.
problems we face? So,
Yes.
mm,
And I'm asking myself this question, is it a question of capacity? So are we sometimes lacking the capacity of dialogue, of conversation, or is it more a question of willingness? So I'm generally capable, I have the skills, but
mm,
maybe I'm not willing to take the risk right? Because now I take some risks by, for example, forgetting about my nice questions that I prepared. It would have been much safer for me to stick to the script. I leave that on the side. It's a bit risky for me. And I also don't know if you also are willing to take the risk. So if I'm taking
Yeah.
the risk, but you have your script, then we still don't have a really good conversation. But I'm exposed because I kind of, I lost my guard. So, what
Yeah.
do you think about that question of willingness and capacity for conversation?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think lots of people feel inhibited. Technology arguably as well deprives them the opportunity to practice because it's a skill that you practice.
Hmm.
I think the kind of bedrock is, all human beings can do this, even those who are most limited. So we all have more capacity than we think. What's interesting is most people uh, feel not very confident about their capacity in conversations. So it clearly kind of, does make us feel vulnerable and stuff like that. So I think yes, we have to create particularly leaders, I think, and particularly in the workplace, people have to create the opportunity for. So if you take something like, Jeff Bezos, so he has this practice where for important meetings where a decision or sort of strategic decision needs to be made, somebody's invited to write something, and then when people come to the meeting, whether it's real or virtual, the first 20 minutes or so are spent reading the thing that's been written. Uh, and that all of that is to create a platform for conversation where everybody's got a start point, which is at least shared, and then they can kind of have a conversation about it. And the other thing is that those meetings, people have learned, I understand, that it's not good to put a hard stop, an hour or so later, because Bezos will want those meetings to go on until they reach the decision or conclusion that
Hmm.
they need to. So, I mean, that's a particular example for a particular purpose. But what I'm pointing out is that somebody like Jeff Bezos has thought about the container that you need to consciously put in place in order to have the kinds of conversation you want to have. So one thing is a personal willingness to practice, much like you practice yoga or do sport or meditation or whatever. But the other is that people in positions of leadership can think carefully and sensitively about the container or the vessel, the space, the meeting, the duration, the people who are there, the start point, the materials you use, and all of these can either aid or inhibit the possibility of conversation. So yes, it's personal, and yes, technology is a problem. I don't agree. Everybody says that, teenagers can't talk to each other, and my response to that, when you read the research, is you go, yeah, but you were a 30-something-year-old researcher asking a 16-year-old about their conversational habits. It's like, come on, what would you have said when you were 16? But you
Hmm.
you can see teenagers
Hmm.
come to life when the context is right. So I don't think it's under threat in the way that people suggest, but I think that we need to both make personal commitments to kind of exercise that muscle and to realize that we're more capable than we think we are. And that people in positions of leadership, be it at home or at work, can engineer or create spaces and containers. Like the family meal, is a
Hmm.
container, a vessel for conversation. That's where my conversational experience was born, really. The book I dedicated to my sisters because, we had endless family conversations. I'm the youngest of three, and our parents
Hmm.
very deliberately did that. So I think we can do that for other people, and I think it's amazing fun. And yes, you need to be willing to take a risk.
Yeah, yeah. I like your example about the board meeting or the meeting that you mentioned with Jeff Bezos, because for me that's like the basic dimension of conversation. Say, okay, we have a common ground of information that we both know, like this piece of paper, and so we create this common ground of information of data that you know and I know, and we can both look at it and say, yeah, that's the same thing. We both look at the same
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Um, and then obviously we also have dimensions that I know that you don't know,
yeah,
and others that you know that I don't know, right?
absolutely.
And then it comes already, then we are maybe more on this dimension that you also mentioned about transfer of information. So I could transfer you stuff that I know that you don't know, maybe, and the other way around. But already there, we need some willingness, right? So I might be, depending on my preferences, I might be very motivated to share my information with you because I want to explain you stuff. Or I maybe just want to use your information. I'm not interested in sharing something with you. I just want to use what you have and get that. So it's still kind of I would say maybe a transactional dimension. But then the third dimension, I think, is also the one you mentioned at one point, is to say this dimension of the things that we both don't know. So this kind of third dimension that I don't know and that you also don't know, but that we can explore together. And I think the deeper it goes into those dimensions, I feel the fewer situation I experienced where I, with someone else together, were capable to really do that. And sometimes it's my incapacity, and sometimes it's the other person's incapacity. But I think that those moments of real dialogue that you mentioned, of saying we explore something that we both don't know, are quite rare. And I'm wondering how to actually get there. So, are there any ingredients, any help, any support we can think of to actually go into those deeper conversations that I think, all would like to have, but we don't have very often?
Yeah, there's a ton, but before I do that, I think I think of it in a slightly different way.
Hmm.
It so I all of those things I recognize that you're saying, but actually I think the most important kind of information. So I wouldn't say that, when you look at the document, you look at the same thing because you have an interpretation that comes from who you are. So that
Hmm.
to me, the more important and more significant part of information is not the information that's out there that you might have technically because we're from different disciplines. It's who you are and what you see. And so, as we speak about what we've read in the example of the Bezos thing, I'm also saying something about myself and who I
Mm.
am, which is where the real kind of, the risk lies, the social risk. But that's also the joy and the beauty and the potential of it, because when people come together, and this is why, kind of the difference between technologies that are made to emulate conversation and the act of human conversation. In the act of human conversation, two worlds meet.
Hmm.
So when I meet and talk with you, all of you is there
Mm.
somehow in the background, all of your experience, all of your background, your upbringing, your interests, your tastes. It's not that you're necessarily accessing them as information, but they're coloring and sensing and infusing kind of everything you say and vice versa. So we're connecting as kind of human beings. And that layer, which is an additional layer beyond the ones you identified, is where I think the real power is. So then to answer your first question, or to respond to it anyway, what can you do about that? Well, if you recognize that's why it's sensitive, because we are talking about ourselves, even as we're talking about other stuff, then things like how you are seated, in very literal things. Do you sit face to face? Do you sit side by side? You'll have a very different conversation if you do.
Mm. Mm.
And so it's not that one is good and one is bad, but it's like, what kind of conversation do you want to have? So a famous and gendered example is that, in a traditional old school family, a man comes home from work, a woman has been doing, a mother has been doing kind of domestic work at home. She wants to sit face to face across a cup of tea or cup of coffee and have an eye-to-eye conversation so that
Mm.
she feels seen and heard. He wants to watch the telly and put his arm around the wife, you know, and be with her, but not have that kind of thing and chat about stuff. And so when if people don't understand the importance of the setup, there's going to be a disconnect. They're both going to come away frustrated. And in a work context, if you're running a workshop and you want to have a conversation about a set of ideas a team or group has been developing, imagine you put the ideas on a table and they're on pieces of paper or cards or post-it notes that are within reach and that can be moved. And you gather around and you're looking at the thing in common on the table and everybody can touch it. That is what you would do if you want to have a conversation where you kind of want things to be moved or changed or questioned or challenged because it's within reach. The sort of metaphorical and literal setup is coherent. If you're close to finishing and you just want to make sure everybody's in agreement, you stick it on the wall and you all stand back shoulder to shoulder and you all look at it. First of all, it's physically harder to change. And secondly, it imbues the conversation with a different kind of tone or sense. So, what you do in order to have those conversations is, in my view, a lot about managing the physical space.
Mm.
It's a lot about if you're leading that conversation or convening that conversation, it'd be about how you show up. So, do you start with an agenda and do you go through it? Or do you how even how you introduce yourself. You're like, hey everybody, how's it going? That's one introduction. Or you could come in and kind of go, so this morning we have a really important decision to make.
Hmm.
Right? Those two are going to invite, and everybody, this is where I think the human brilliance is often mistaken. People, without having to think or make any effort, will immediately respond to those two different verbal cues.
Hmm.
And they won't, this won't part through their conscious brain, but they'll kind of go, oh, we're doing this. We're having this kind of a conversation today. Or, oh, we're doing that. Like, oh, I'll say something light and flippant and trivial because we just like messing around. Or, oh, we've got an important decision to make. I better keep quiet and say something clever. So you as a convener have kind of all that kind of possibility. Uh, there's an interesting story actually that is a very different environment from Amazon, which was told to me by the guy who was running Zen Center in San Francisco. And Zen Center is a business as well as a kind of spiritual organization.
Hmm.
And they found that there was a huge amount of frustration for their meetings, that they didn't really get the sense of anything ever getting done. There was tons of stuff under any other business. And because it's Zen Center, they always did a kind of short check-in anyway. And what this guy decided to do was to do the opposite of what you might expect, which instead of sort of cutting the extra stuff and focusing on the business, which is what the kind of problem seemed to require, he did the opposite. And he said, I'd like you to sort of check in properly and tell you how you are and what you're feeling and what's really going on for you. So the check-in took forever. But then what they found was over time, not instantly, but they then did the business really really quickly because actually what was going on was that the people were needing to feel seen and heard and connected, and they were kind of trying to do that through the business issues. So the whole thing was muddied. And so the technique he was using there was to be really open, you know. And if you want to get a bit more
Hmm.
granular, I used to do qualitative research, and often in difficult meetings or conversations, I have people always ask what are the killer questions to get a conversation going, which I think is an interesting question in its own right because it assumes that there is some trick or technique that will unlock this, and I don't think there is. But
Hmm.
that said, there are a couple of things which kind of can work. So my favorite ever question was, so,
That's good.
because it implies there is something to be said.
Hmm.
Somebody somewhere here has got something to say, and uh, but it's very, very open, about as open as you could be. And we don't like silence very much. I mean, we really don't. And so there's no doubt that sooner or later somebody will say something. And it's quite likely if you ask such an open question, which isn't also a question, it's just a statement, it's a kind of inference, then people will speak that which actually matters to them. So sometimes it's about doing less. Um,
Hmm.
and the other one, which is this I learned from my friend Nick Parker, who got it from somebody I can't remember now, but in the UK at least, in Anglo culture, and I think Anglos, people who speak English as a native language, tend to assume this is true the world over, but I promise you it's not, because it's absolutely not true in Spain. But in the English-speaking world, it is entirely normal, almost routine, when you meet somebody for the first time to say, "Oh, what do you do?" And so some people hate that question. They hate asking it, they hate answering it. And I kind of understand that. I'm kind of in that camp myself, except that at the same time, it's a perfectly legitimate question in a society where work occupies a big space. Uh, and so here's the interesting thing. It's not actually about the first question, it's about the second question. So imagine I say to you, so Paul, what do you do? And just give me an answer, a random answer, true one, false one, whatever. So Paul, what do you do?
I facilitate workshops.
That must be hard.
It depends on the people.
Right. So the response, that must be hard,
Hmm.
works whatever the person says, right? So
Hmm.
what do you do? I'm an astronaut. That must be hard. What do you do? I sweep the roads. That must be hard. What do you do? I'm unemployed. That must be hard. And what
Hmm.
that must be hard does is it shows why killer questions aren't the answer, because actually what it's really doing is it's showing concern, care, interest, and it's actually elevating the other person. Whatever it is, you're
Hmm.
acknowledging and recognizing that there will be something hard about that. And as you started to do, people get drawn in to go, well, no, it is because, or no, it's not because, or Well, it's kind of hard, but not in the way you might imagine. And
Hmm.
you're off. As
Hmm.
soon as you're there, you're off. Because now you're not talking about the conventional status battle of who's got the bigger job. You're
Yeah.
talking about how do you relate to that? How do you feel about it? Is it a job you love? Is it a job you hate? Is it not about your job at all? Because what you do is not a job of work at all.
Yeah. 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 I really like your examples of, this facilitative methods to help other people have good conversations.
Mm.
And you mentioned a lot of great examples. Now, for example, in our situation, we don't have a facilitator, right? It's just the two of us.
Right.
Um, and I realize that I constantly face certain challenges in a conversation. For example, now you give me a lot of keywords. You told me a lot of really nice examples. And so I have a lot of different options to connect with, right? So you said something about Bezos, and you said something about a workshop, then you said something about a friend of yours. And all the time I have this choice of, okay, where to connect to next, right? So
Yeah.
there's this aspect. But then I also have some own ideas which I would like to share. So I've constantly this challenge of making a decision how to act or react to what's going on. Um, and this reminds me so much of those three dimensions that you mentioned in your book, right? Of like noticing more, so I can notice more what you're doing or what's going on. Um,
Yeah.
I can let go of my own ideas, which maybe are blocking also the conversation because I had this agenda, I had this really, really great question that I was preparing since yesterday that I cannot ask now anymore. This kind of letting go of my own stuff. Um, and the third dimension of using everything that's there. Um,
Mm.
and I'm wondering, I mean, those who read your book know about this, but maybe you can share a bit your thoughts of around those challenges, right? Of um, in a conversation, what to use, what not to use, when to do a step forward, when to go back. In coaching, there's this nice wording of leading versus pacing. So when do I take the lead? I take
Mm.
over. When am I just like flowing with what you are saying? And I think whenever it goes into an extreme, it's getting boring, right? If I'm the one following you all the time, it might be a bit like a monologue for you and also boring for you in the end. If I'm too pushing, and asking you kind of questions you don't really want to answer, it's also not nice. So how do you look at this play with, choice and balance that we all have to play when we are in a conversation ourselves?
Yeah. Well, it's always a question of context and
Hmm.
which is why there's no kind of formulate right answers or killer questions.
Hmm.
And it's really a question of, I guess, follow the energy. And so, and what I mean by that is you have to sort of the instrument of noticing what you have energy for is actually your body.
Hmm.
So you kind of have to tune into. So there's no formula. It's no like, oh, you should 60% ask questions and 40% make statements.
Hmm.
Um, uh, for those two reasons, it will change. So, for example, I spend a lot of time in this kind of conversation online, kind of apropos of nothing, with various friends and colleagues all around the world. And with some of them, the rhythm of conversation, the duration of each person's speech is very long and slow.
Hmm.
And there's a kind of mirroring going on because that's the natural rhythm that the two of us, it's not necessarily in them, it's in the gap between us, the way we relate. With other people, it's much more staccato. It might be quick fire backwards and forwards. So it's always going to kind of vary in that. So you have to be able to sense and notice kind of what's the natural rhythm here. And then you do have a choice, which is do I want to go with it or do I want to disrupt it? So,
Hmm.
you do have to, I suppose the basic notion here is it's a practice. And the thing about practice, so rather than a formula, you're looking to keep practicing the practice. And the thing about a practice is anything worth doing requires practice. You're never really done. And the more I practice, the luckier I get. So just the knowing of, if you know those three maxims, notice more, let go, use everything, just knowing them doesn't help you at all.
Hmm.
You have to keep asking yourself, what do I want now? You know,
Hmm.
and so do I go in or do I go out? Will depend upon what's your energy for. You know,
Yeah.
has the
So it's
thing
about
that,
my energy. It's about looking at
yeah,
my
your own
energy or
instrument, your
okay.
body as instrument, because that's
Mm.
all you've got, right? I don't really know what's going on for you, even if you were
Mhm.
sitting in the room here with me, but my body will give me a sense. if I pay attention with my senses, I might get a read on what's going on for you, but my instrument is my own body, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And what I want or what brings me alive is a legitimate part of this too. That's not selfish or egotistical because I'm constantly in relationship and reacting to you. And
Hmm.
so, and the reason this is even worth mentioning is because just because it's your body doesn't mean that you have a good read on it.
Yeah,
Because
also true.
there's a kind of, if you're a dancer or a yoga teacher or a sports person, probably you do. But there's a kind of training yourself to pay attention and training yourself to interpret. So if you just take stress or anxiety, I get nervous, or that risk you were talking about, I don't want to step forward. Each of us will experience that differently. Some people hunch their shoulders, close their throat, other people clench their jaw, some people have a sinking feeling in the gut of their stomach. So if you can learn to recognize your own response, then you can go, oh, there's that response of mine. Do I want to go with that? Or am I going to let that dominate me? And often in the act of noticing the anxiety, for example, will dissipate because you're becoming familiar with it, because it's an instinctive response. And actually, you can then kind of, you know, get beyond that and ask yourself, well, what's of interest here? So it's kind
Mm.
of constant practice. So there's no simple answer to what should I choose. It would depend. And as I say, the context is going to matter as well, which is why there are no formulae. Um,
Mm.
so in the end, then the things which help are very simple ideas to try, see what happens, try again, and keep trying out.
Yeah.
And so that notion of kind of, and I think letting go of the idea that there is an answer, that there's a magic formula, that there are tools and techniques you can use, but with very few exceptions. I mean, the only one I found is that, that must be hard. I think that's the only thing, whatever anybody says for their occupation, you can work with it. But as I
Mm.
pointed out, it's because of the function it's playing,
Hmm.
it's doing other things. It's not the words themselves. And so I think, if there's a single key, it's like pay attention.
Yeah.
Pay attention to yourself, pay attention to the other person, pay attention to what you want, pay attention to what you don't like, pay attention to your feelings, and then ask yourself, what do I want to do with that?
Hmm. Hmm. I find it really helpful that you also mentioned the attention towards yourself because I mean, personally, I think I have a tendency to very much focus on the other person, be very attentive what is going on or might be going on. As you say, I'm not sure about it, I cannot know, but I'm really curious about the other person. And
Yeah.
maybe there's this risk of forgetting a bit about yourself, right? About the focus on you.
Yeah. And I kind of like the idea of yourself, you're a kind of antennae. And if you're a practiced and experienced facilitator as you are, there are things that will be, if you think of yourself as a kind of antennae, and what I mean by that is I mean yourself in a fuller sense than just your mind. I think where it is dangerous is when your mind and the chatter and the monkey mind is saying, you should do this, or you need to do something now to be important or to look good. That
Mm.
bit of yourself is good to kind of hold at a certain distance. But if you're in a room, leading a room, and there's a feeling you get that there's something's not right, if you've got the capacity to kind of go, I'm kind of feeling something's not quite right here. Is anyone else feeling that? Or am I barking up the wrong tree here? Almost invariably in my experience, someone will say, well, that's funny you mentioned that, but actually, that exercise we just did, I think we haven't really spoken about the issue.
Mm.
You know,
Hmm.
I mean, I've had the occasion where I've done something like this, and it's transpired that everybody in the room is really nervous because some piece of news has broken about the company, which I was
Mm.
ignorant of, which is affecting the mood. And then they tell me, well, the thing is, yeah, we're kind of waiting to see what happens with the share price because our pension plans are about to go down the pan. And so that's what I mean by paying attention to yourself. It's not, it's like using yourself as an antennae, respecting that, not being locked onto it, not saying there's something wrong here. What is it? That won't work,
Hmm.
but using it as a source of kind of vague and diffuse information to then move into inquiry and go, is anyone else feeling this? And there's a guy I work with, Johnny Moore, who is absolutely brilliant at this and completely brazen in one respect, but it's so fruitful. What I mean by brazen is Johnny will say, I'm noticing actually I'm getting really bored now. Is anyone else bored? If it's just me, it's fine, we can carry on. Or he'll say, yeah, I sort of feel like we're all going through a kind of performance of saying things that sound good, but I don't really feel like I know what we're actually talking about. And that opens floodgates often.
But it's a
clear.
strong intervention, huh?
It's a very strong intervention. He does it
Mm.
very skillfully and very judiciously, but he can only do it because he's paying attention to his body as instrument, to
Hmm.
himself. It's not an idea. It's not coming from his ego. He doesn't do
Yeah,
it in order to kind of look dramatic. He
yeah,
does it because he's sensing and feeling, and he's not always right, and it doesn't always yield anything, but well, that's the back to the uncertainty and the vulnerability.
yeah. And what you mentioned now is so interesting to me because to me it really shows the importance of how you say something and not what you say. And I feel that when we talk about conversations and or dialogue competence, leadership skills, I think often we are on this level of rhetorics, basically, of what to say, which words to use, what, as you say, like killer phrases or killer questions. Um, and also this question of how much should I ask questions and how much should I give answers. And I feel even that, like, you can ask a question in a very directive way, to actually control the discussion with questions.
Totally.
um, you can also be very curious with an answer, I think. I mean, but with a statement, giving a statement can be maybe more curious towards the other person than a question that is very directive. So
Yeah,
all of that for me
absolutely.
is still on a superficial level. And what I really like about what you're sharing here is, to look below is from which maybe inner mindset are these people saying things, and not exactly what are they saying.
Yeah, the how is way more important than the what. There's an improv exercise we do where you get also I can kind of do it in a ham way now, right? So you ask four different people to think of a real question to which their real answer was no, the single word no. And then you have the four different people just say their no. And it kind of looks something like this. No, 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 no.
Mhm.
That's the same word, right? And then what you get the audience to do is to kind of guess what the question was. And
Mhm.
I mean, that's just kind of for fun. It's not really a guessing game. But what you're trying to illustrate is that there are well, there's an infinite number of totally different ways of rendering that single word, which we can all decode, pretty quickly. Because even if you
Mhm.
don't get the right scenario, you go, oh, that was a question they were delighted to be able to answer no to. It was something they really didn't want to do. This was one they really weren't sure about whether it was yes or no, but they ended up on no. And that's the level at which we're responding to the how something's communicated all the time. And all the brilliance of the human that I've been talking about lives in the how, the mood, the tone, the expression, the gesture, all of that. And actually we're brilliant also at reading all of that. So we have this dance and this pretense that's all about changing the words on the slide. It doesn't really matter what the
Mhm.
words on the slide are. It's a kind of about the how. And that's also why it kind of feels risky because there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
And so then what you end up is having a conversation that's not really a conversation. And when somebody does what Johnny does, he's kind of pointing that out. And actually, as you said, it's a relief to people because they go, oh, now we can really talk.
Mm.
Now he's kind of punctured that illusion of this kind of polish. And I think the other thing is that that gives you a huge radius of action, right? Because then you can pay attention to and practice and can become more skilled at paying attention to how you say things.
Mhm.
So, for example, I spent about half an hour once with a very senior executive from a very big German media company, having her come into a room. So I sat in the room and she just came in. And the reason we were doing this is that she was aware, she was quite a short woman as well. So and she's not very punctual. So she was quite aware that she was often entering a meeting late and she would be the most important person. And so she had reasoned that it really mattered how she came into the room.
Mm.
And that was going to affect the conversation that happened subsequently. And I thought this was incredibly sophisticated on her part. So we played around with that. And what we were playing around with was not how to enter a room, not what's the right way to enter a room. What we were just trying to do was sensitize her to make her more aware of all of the dimensions that were available to her as she came in a room. So what we actually did was I'd say like come in like you're being chased by a wolf. And she wasn't allowed to say anything. We stopped it before she got to say anything. Come in like you're out of breath. Come in like you've got lead weights on your feet. Come in like the floor's hot. And And all we were doing was exploring the range of the how. How do you come into a room?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
what she was able to discover is a whole range of obvious things like speed, pace, rhythm, angle, gesture, posture, tone, all of that was implicit, all of it in the body language and the movement. And then she could choose.
Hmm.
And the other thing that needed to happen for this to be effective for her was she needed to pause on the threshold momentarily, like 3 seconds, in order to have the space to consider how did she want to come into the room on that occasion for those people with whatever the conversation was going to be about, you know.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so if you can kind of, as soon as you start paying attention to the how, then a huge range of things become available to you, you know. How do we want to sit? How do we want to start? You know, how do we want to be together here? You know, how do
Yeah.
I want to show up? How do I want to dress? Uh,
Mm.
for this conversation,
Yeah.
beyond the conventions, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it kind of it's almost like I once did some work with sort of psychoanalysts using the improv stuff, and what was hilarious was they absolutely obsessed about the what. You know, oh, he said cat in that story. That means this, that, and the other. And it doesn't mean anything at all. Where the action is in those improv scenes as well is in how you say it,
Mm.
you know. And so it felt to me like the psychoanalysts were kind of it was like they had clothes on their front and they were naked on their backs and they were paying and they didn't notice that they were naked over here and they were paying all attention to the clothes bit, you know.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and what I like about this is, also the example with the woman entering the room in different ways,
Mm.
is that of course we can theoretically think of all the possibilities of how to enter a room, but this makes it a very pragmatic exploration of the of your personal range of because there's of course like a theoretical range, but then there's also the range in which you feel comfortable or that you are
Absolutely.
capable to do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And talking about conversations, now I'm thinking a bit about myself. When we talk about this balance of asking questions and giving answers, for a very long time I was very much comfortable, or I'm still much more comfortable to ask questions, right? So my default mode in conversations is to ask questions. That's why probably I also have this podcast now. But I realized that that's not always the best intervention at any point in a conversation, because if I'm only asking questions all the time, it's quite tiring for the other person. Like the other person has to do all the work.
Yeah. There's
Um,
there's an improv game that we use to embody this and demonstrate it. You
uh-huh.
get two actors playing a scene, and one of them can do and say anything, and the other one has a script, unusually in improv. And they're allowed to say yes, thank you, sounds good to me, and I'll go along with that. So they're all agreements. And
Hmm.
the reason that you do this scene is to show exactly the point, or have people experience actually exactly the point you just made, which is that, oh my God, does the other person have to work hard?
Hmm.
Now, those aren't questions, but the question in a conversation can, when used to excess, play the same role because what you're not doing is you're not offering any material or content to which the other person can respond. That might seem paradoxical because isn't that just what a question is? But the important thing here, Adam Mastroianni, who's brilliant on all of this, he writes about what he calls doorknobs. So a doorknob in a conversation is that kind of insight or risk or chance that you take by offering something up that some has some kind of element of disclosure or revelation or interest that goes beyond the question that the other
Hmm.
person can take
Yeah.
and do something with. And so if you're only asking the conventional questions or straightforward questions, apart from the fact, as you've already mentioned, as I demonstrated earlier with my so,
Hmm.
statements and questions, what's one and what's another is not quite as clear as you might think. But, another example would be a colleague who is a psychologist, one time working at Oxford in a facilitative capacity with a small group. I said to him, John, this conversation's it's not going very far. I need some, have you got in your experience, what would be questions that help to open up a group like this,
Hmm.
So this was, I was still on the search for the clear questions. And he said to me, he said, well, Rob, what do you think a good question would be? I was like, oh, come on. Don't answer another question with a question with another question. That's like, that is really unhelpful.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually what I did, it wasn't that same occasion, but it was the same problem. Sometimes I think it's much more useful. I'll go back to the setting again. So I had a group which was 6 people, 5 of whom were from the Indian subcontinent and were either in engineers or from kind of IT. And
Mm,
one of whom was the CEO of a theatre and herself a musician. And so there were two very different kinds of people in the room. But the 5 kind of engineers were just having the kind of trivial surface conversation the whole time. And she kept looking at me kind of going, this is not going anywhere. And I couldn't do anything about it. So the first day I took the table out and we just sat in a circle, and that got the normal comments about Alcoholics Anonymous or something. And that didn't work either. And so the next day, there were, as I say, 6 of them and me. I arranged 3 pairs of chairs and I tested all this by sitting in them, by getting there early. And I set the 3 pairs of chairs so that if you sat in the 2 chairs, you could sit down without touching the person, but it was
mhm,
very close. And then the pairs were not so close that they were together, but they were close enough so that you felt you were going to be overheard. So there were
mhm,
2 levels of deliberate discomfort. And then I set a 7th chair off to one side, as it were, in a supervisory position. And that morning, when they came in, the first chap came in, sat down in a chair, put his bag down, immediately stood up again. The rest of them came in and stood up. They wouldn't sit down. And I just said to them, why do you think I've set the chairs like this? And then we had the conversation that we were trying to
mm,
get to,
yeah.
which was all about the deliberate discomfort and all that kind of stuff. And then it didn't
Mhm,
matter how we set the chairs after that. The conversations went where they needed to go. So rather than trying to think of the killer question, it was about thinking about resetting the room. And I think the reason I got frustrated with my psychologist colleague was that questions can be used defensively. John wasn't giving me anything to go on. He was just asking another question.
yeah,
And there is a sense in which there is generosity in listening to others and asking questions, but there is also generosity in making statements and being willing to take a risk.
yeah,
And so if you never enact or embody that second kind of generosity, something's missing. And the other person will sense or feel it even if they can't articulate it. And
yeah.
the conversation will just trivialize.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, and I think in my personal case, there's also this little dimension of laziness because if I ask the questions, I don't have to give the answers, right? So
Right.
it's easier for me. I mean, as a podcaster, it's also the luxury, right? So I can sit back and listen to your amazing stories, and I don't have to do a lot.
Mm.
But in a normal conversation, I'm also a blank piece of paper. If I don't share anything about me, like you look at me like you don't know anything about me because I don't share anything, and because you just mentioned this like deliberate discomfort, I realized that my comfort zone was in asking questions, but that this was not always beneficial for conversation. So I had to get out of my comfort zone and share more about myself, which I didn't enjoy so much, but I saw was beneficial for the other side.
Yeah, because
Um,
it's modeling, right? It's like if never ask somebody to do that which you're not willing to do yourself. So if you want
mhm,
somebody to share, if you want the conversation to go deeper, to have more substance and more possibility, it's not just about personal disclosure and secrets and all that kind of stuff. It's like the more of we show, the more there is in play, the more we can do together. So if we're just skating over the surface of things, staying with in the work world, staying with our roles
mhm,
rather than with the people we are who have those roles, then less is possible. So it's not just about getting close to each other in a personal sense. So, and I think that so the disclosure is, as Mastroianni says, the doorknob, as he puts it, is it does have a sort of tinge of frisson. And so there's merit in being willing to take that risk.
mhm.
And that models for the other person, what you're inviting them to do as well, so that the whole thing can, to use another Mastroianni image, he says somehow in conversation we use each other as support to climb up into the air, to get to a place where we couldn't be, which is an image I really love. And I think we tend to dumb the world down into questions and answers. I think there's a couple of things that I use a lot these days. So one is I don't talk about answers. In the English language, answer suggests something finished, closed,
Mhm.
possibly ideal or close to ideal. So I talk about questions and responses.
Hmm.
because responses are plural by definition. You have yours, I have mine, she has hers, and they're all kind of valid at some level. So that's enriching and multiplying. The other thing is, I think there are more possibilities than just questions or responses, even. And so I worked with somebody for many years. We had a very productive working relationship, and part of it was she said, "Well, I'm a kind of half a sentence sort of person," and and so she wouldn't exactly ask questions necessarily, but she wouldn't finish thoughts. So she'd start them and then sort of see where you would take them.
Hmm.
And so, as somebody seeking to collaborate and work with her, where conversation was our medium, and we were trying to generate ideas and possibilities, this for leadership programs, she was very comfortable not having the end. And then you might add either exactly the end she was sort of imagining, which would be validation for what she was thinking, or you might add something she was totally not expecting, which would be novel and interesting, or
Yeah.
anything in between. And so another possibility is just to not kind of finish, and kind of,
Hmm.
well, I don't know. I was thinking that this is a bit hard, but is there something else? I don't know. Is there a different way? Or, and just sort of pausing and seeing
Yeah.
because people's associative capacity is extraordinary, and each individual's associative capacity is unique. You
Yeah.
know, there are patterns overall, but we've each got unique experience. So there are kind of more possibilities than we might imagine.
Yeah. And probably the more I think about it and the more I listen to you, there are always these like two layers, right? So on the one hand, what do I need in that moment? For example, do I feel very uncomfortable doing that? So I will not do it. But then also, what does the conversation need?
Right.
And so that's how I imagine it. And recently, I had a dinner with several friends, and there was one person. Um, and again, I'm really on the spectrum. I really love to ask questions. I don't need to give long responses. But there was one person, we sat there, I think, for almost 3 hours, sharing many, many stories, amazing stories all the time, not asking one single question throughout the whole dinner. And even for a person like me, that was a bit too much because at some point I felt, okay, at some point I would expect you to ask me something, like whatever it is, like at least once. Um,
Yeah.
and there I realized that, of course, it can also go the other way around, right? So asking questions, yeah, it's nice, or giving responses, but you can have a disbalance in both ways. And that, with
Yeah.
that person, I realized, okay, we are on the two very extreme sides of the spectrum.
Yeah. And I think there again, one of the things you need to develop a sensibility to, the capacity to notice, is where do I lie on that and several other spectrum, you
Hmm.
know? Not necessarily in order to try and force yourself to change it, though that can also be an interesting experiment, to just be aware of it.
Hmm.
There's a famous New Yorker cartoon, which is two people at a cocktail party, and one says to the other, "So that's enough about me. What do you think about me?" You know, and we've all probably experienced people like that. What's interesting is that also is a form of, even though it's narcissistic, it's also can be a form of defense. Because as long as I keep talking about me, I stop the conversation going to something where I don't want, maybe it's really difficult for me to offer an opinion to someone else. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's what do I need and what does this combination need? What's interesting, therefore, is in conversations. Certainly in conversations where there's more than two people, which is often the case, and possibly even in conversations where there are only two people, the two things can come together because let's stick with an example where there's something of an audience, let's say. So there's me and then there's a group of people and there's other people talking. And I'm trying to juggle, should I attend to my own needs? Should I attend to the needs of the conversation? Um, let's say that there is somebody who is obsessively talking about themselves, and and you start to notice in your own body that that's affecting you, and then to hypothesize, much like my friend Johnny Moore would, that like, well, there's probably other people feeling that. And so then what you're able to do is to attend to the needs of the conversation and quite deliberately say, maybe even through body language, is, look away from the person speaking and give all your attention to someone else, which is a very strong physical invitation to
Mm,
hear from someone else. Or you might do that in speech. And you might say, John, sorry, I'm just sorry to interrupt, but just really curious, Mary, what do you think about that? Or what you said before, I'm kind of curious to know more about that. So
mm,
in that point, you're serving the conversation's needs. If your antennae is working and you've noticed something kind of that's real, everybody will love you for that.
mhm.
and in the end, we all want to be loved, right? So you're in meeting your own needs there kind of fantastically by meeting the needs of the conversation. And over time, actually, again, back to the unconscious but sort of natural brilliance of people, I think people realize that. In work groups, I think people are really good at knowing who are the people that kind of serve the conversation, and therefore I want to be in conversation with them. So it's serving their, kind of ego needs as well.
Yeah,
So you don't necessarily, those two don't necessarily have to be in opposition. They won't always be in concert. And being aware that they're both in play enables you to get curious about, oh, which one should I pay attention to now?
yeah,
Because let's say
yeah,
you feel you've been totally left out of the conversation.
yeah.
You
And
know,
to me, it really showed the importance of enlarging your own spectrum of what you're capable to do. Because, you know, at the beginning, I thought, okay, it's a perfect match. Like one person really likes to ask questions, the other person really likes to give responses. That's
right.
perfect. But then you're really stuck because as a person who only can ask questions, if you want, as you just gave the example, you want to take the lead and maybe redirect the conversation,
You need to
you
know
have to be able to take that lead.
Yeah.
And if you can't, you will be very stuck in very long conversations. I have a lot of people telling me this who have this problem of being stuck in conversations they don't want to continue.
Yeah.
At cocktail parties, for example, or networking events, where you're stuck with one person, you're not able to leave.
Yeah.
And I think that had a lot to do also with what you mentioned of being able to redirect, to take the lead at some point.
And so a cocktail party or a networking event is one kind of is one context where that can happen in a kind of in a new relationship. But there's the opposite problem, which is lifelong conversations which are stuck in, so siblings who still talk to each other in their 50s and 60s in the way that they spoke to each other when they were children,
Mhm.
because they've got stuck in a pattern because nobody's ever been willing to try something different, to ask a question where they normally wouldn't, or to make a statement where they normally wouldn't. So yeah, those patterns can kind of fossilize over time and become very, very limiting, rigid kind of structures.
Mhm.
So yeah. The other thing I think actually, just while we're talking about cocktail parties and networking events, I ran a thing for about 3 or 4 years called Yellow, which was it began in the pandemic. It was online. It was conversation based, if you like. We did lots of different things, but one of the things we discovered is that there is absolutely no need whatsoever if you want a meaningful conversation. There is no need to know any of the kind of pragmatic stuff about people. So we had people in conversation for 6 months without knowing what their jobs were or field
Mhm.
of work or whether they had, where, I mean, they know where they lived just because that kind of came out in the wash. And it wasn't that it was a great secret. It was just that if you want to have a conversation with someone, it's much better to meet them as the person they are, not as the job they do or the role they play or in the industry they inhabit.
Mhm.
And so what's really interesting is often people feel, well, I need to get all that information before I can start having a proper conversation with them. Whereas my view is that actually all of that stuff, just jump right over it. It stops you having, a proper conversation.
Mhm. Mhm.
One of
Mhm.
my best friends who's a doctor, I met him at the Do Lectures. I was there as a speaker. But it's a very small event. So, you're just in the queue for tea and there's this guy in front of me. And I did say to him, I said, what did you do? What do you do? And he says, I'm a doctor. He said, but I couldn't tell any of my colleagues that because they'd think I'm mad coming to something like this. And so immediately we were kind of through the trivia. So yes, I knew he was a doctor, but what I was interested in is, well, if your colleagues think you're mad, then why are you here?
Mhm.
Right? So
Yeah.
they think you're mad for coming, but you think that you couldn't possibly tell them. So now you're interesting to me.
Yeah.
You're not just the label of doctor. In fact, you've made a very strong statement about what the label of doctor or being a doctor means. And you clearly don't see yourself as part of that. So what's going
Mhm.
on there, And yeah, I mean, 15 years later, we're, best friends. Um,
Amazing. That's a
yeah,
nice story, yeah. You
yeah.
know, I recently talked to a neuroscientist, Jeff Bergdorf, very interesting person from Northwestern University in the US. and he's doing a lot of research on playfulness actually.
Oh, right.
And
Okay.
I think so. I talked also with him about conversations, and what I found interesting is he was saying that the activity of a conversation apparently is the closest that we as adults get to children's free play. So when children have free play, they are somewhere sitting in the grass, and then suddenly everything becomes magical wonderland. So they really, this is free associative play, not like monopoly or like structured play, but really the free play that children play a lot. um, and I found it really interesting that he was saying conversations for adults is the closest we get to that.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And your example with the encounter at the tea counter, for me, it's a bit like that because it became a bit playful, right, in that moment, and it got away from this like serious introduction to something playful.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that's brilliant. And I'll look that guy's work up because that sounds really interesting. And that's certainly true from the lived experience perspective. So, as I said earlier, I spend a lot of my time in this kind of free conversation, and it feels very playful. But to know that the science is kind of backing that up, I think is really interesting. And I think the playfulness, I think that's exactly what this doctor, he's called Neil, what he did, and what he continues to do. So, for example, I started to work with him and his team sometime after that, and we were in a pub in London after work, just around the corner from the hospital, and they were all anaesthetists. And I remember saying to them, so anesthetics, is it a science or is it an art? And they kind of went, oh, that's a great question, great question. So they went off in a huddle and went, oh, we need to think about that. You get a round in and we'll go off and think about it. And they came back only about 5 minutes later and they went, wow, we've decided what it is. And I said, well, what's your answer? What's your response? And they said, well, it's 60% science. And actually the 60% that is purely science, the machines would do better than us. And actually we get in the way.
mhm.
But the 40% that remains, it's not just an art, it's a dark art. We don't really know what we're doing, except what they would mean by that is it would, to be technical about it, what they meant was it would be hard for us to express in conventional, propositional, scientific knowledge why we're administering this drug, not that one, or in this mixture of gases or whatever it is.
Mm,
So by the conventional measures of kind of physicalist science, it wouldn't meet muster. Hence, it's an art. But of course, that doesn't mean that they're just acting randomly. They've got deep practice, they've got a visceral sense, they've got all the wealth and complexity of human judgment and experience, and they are bringing that to bear in a kind of artistic or craft-based way, if you like. And
mm,
so, what the playfulness, their willingness to play with that question, and it's no coincidence, as you rightly spotted, that they're the he's not their boss because it doesn't work like that in medicine, but they're the kind of character of this of Neil who I befriended. It infuses all of their practice with that sense of playfulness, which and this is an elite unit. What's really
mhm.
interesting about this isn't the kind of the regular jobbing doctors that would rather, I mean, they probably would rather be in the pub, but this is a unit which consistently wins, stellar awards for excellence.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a coincidence. And there's a lot of playfulness in the way that they approach their work. So to hear that conversation is from a neuroscientific perspective as close as adults get to free play, which is, I think there's a lot of evidence in the educational world to suggest that we need more of that in schooling and not less,
Mm.
is enormously encouraging. And that's the kind of thing, to go back to the very beginning of this conversation. It's like, oh, damn, if I knew that now, I'd phone up Jeff Bergdorf and interview him and put him in the book, because
Yeah.
it helps when you've got that kind of scientific evidence
Yeah.
for things, even if you already know them to be true from your own lived experience.
Right. He'll
So
be
I
on the
love
podcast soon, so you can watch his episode if
that.
you're
Okay,
interested.
great. Yeah, I
Yeah.
will.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I agree so much with what you said that playful conversations, of course, they are more fun sometimes, or often I would say they're also more innovative, they're more insightful, and so on. But still, at the workplace, usually we have serious conversations, right? These professional conversations, they have this etiquette, they have this formality, and I'm wondering how we can become more playful in our conversations. Are there any tricks, or is it really a matter of personality? Because I
Well, I
agree
think
with you, some of the top performing teams, like high level researchers, I also met some of them, they're extremely playful, maybe because they are so skilled. I don't know what it is, but
Yeah.
most people I meet, unfortunately, and including myself in many occasions, I think I'm still too serious in my professional conversations.
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's horses for courses, right? So you don't want playful, lively, creative, messy conversations the whole time,
Yeah, that's also
right?
true.
So I think distinguishing what kind of a conversation you have, what's the purpose of it?
Mm,
What's the value of it? What do we need to do or decide? Or is it like Jeff Bezos conversations? Does it need to be open-ended? Because we don't, maybe the conversation is to find out what it is we need to decide, you know.
mhm,
So I think that you need to be able to distinguish. I think if you did that, if you spend a little bit of thought consciously in advance of, and let's face it, most conversations in the workplace happen in what we call meetings of some kind or another. Not the only kind, there's water cooler conversations, but those come with their own natural informality, so you probably don't need to worry about those. What you might do is encourage more of them. So the Harvard biologist Richard Lewontin, he designed his laboratory workspace so that nobody could get anywhere basically without going past four other desks. So the routes in and the routes to the water cooler and the photocopier. And he did that deliberately to have people come up against each other so that the opportunity for informal conversation was, if you like, the surface area of it was increased.
mhm,
So, so you could think about how to design your office space or how to design your day in order to promote more opportunities for informal conversation. But in the formal ones we call meetings, I think if you thought clearly and sensitively about the different kinds of conversations you have, a number of things would happen. First of all, I think you'd realize that a lot of the conversations we go through are actually unnecessary altogether, that they're a
mhm,
piece of theatre that makes everybody feel safe or stops people from having to go away and think about the hard things or do some writing or whatever. So I think you'd have less meetings to start with, and then distinguish between those where there is a very real and concrete need, which there often is, to go through things in detail, to deal with the concrete, to decide, to tick off, all of that stuff. It happens, it needs to happen, but know that you're doing it. Don't mix it up with other things. And then signal and design, as I've been saying, the context and the environment, the room, the space, the duration, the materials, all the rest of it, uh, in order to both signal and promote the playfulness, the exploratory nature of it, and make that clear to people that it's not only safe and okay to do that, that that's what you actually want and need.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and I think when you do that, most people will breathe a huge sigh of relief and go, "Oh, thank God." you know. And then the last piece of all of that is then I'm assuming that you're playing some form of leadership role here. It doesn't mean leadership doesn't mean you're the boss, but it means that you're the one convening the meeting or you have control of the agenda or you whatever it is. Although actually you can do this from a participant perspective as well in someone else's meeting, but how you show up, like I said before, how you signal what we're about.
Mm.
Um, uh, uh, those things give off a wealth of cues that invite people. So modeling the behavior you want.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, beyond that, there are techniques and tools you can introduce.
Mm.
Like, you can do, I mean, a fabulous thing a client of mine did was absolutely brilliant. We were doing a super serious strategy meeting. It was about the whole future of the brand and the company. And it was going to last 3 days. It was a 3-day workshop. And at the beginning, what he'd done is he'd gone out and bought uh, pairs of huge, fluffy, crazy, mad animal slippers for everybody, right? Tigers and fish and kangaroos, this kind of total novelty, absolutely absurd item of clothing. And we were doing this meeting in a boardroom in the City of London in a skyscraper. And the first thing that you did when you came in is you had to take your shoes off, which is already a big taboo broken.
Mm.
And then you had to choose a pair of slippers. Now, most of the time we're sitting at a boardroom table, so nobody can see the slippers, but everybody knows they're there.
Yeah.
And and it was just a signal that levity, openness, laughter, difference were all not only admissible, but actually to be invited, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I mentioned that to a friend recently, and she just mentioned it in passing. And she's had a sort of family crisis over Christmas, where all sorts of, as often happens. family dynamics came to the fore. And she'd actually, because she hates buying Christmas presents for people, she'd bought all these slippers as a Christmas
Mm.
present and in the same spirit. And in the middle of this crisis, she said to her son, "Do you think I should give people the slippers?" Because she was like, "Oh, this is getting really way too serious." And he went, "Absolutely, mum, now's the time." He's a grown-up child. Uh, and she said, "It saved my Christmas, you know." Because
Wow.
when you're talking to somebody who's wearing this absurd pair of slippers, you know, so that's
Yeah.
just an example, but there's a million
Yeah.
things you could do. But none of that, just to backtrack, the one thing you have to do is to think consciously and deliberately about what kind of a conversation is it, what do you want, and what might you do to make the kind of conversation you want more likely rather than less. And mostly
Mm.
what people do is they don't do that. They just book a meeting room
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's it, you know.
Such an amazing story. I love it. I love it. Um, and as you said before, right? So we don't always want playful conversations,
Oh.
and we don't always want conversations at all. And that's one point I also wanted to discuss before we close, because you wrote a whole book about do pause, right? About the
Mm.
importance of pausing. Um, so for me, pausing is also maybe to not have a conversation or to have a pause during a conversation.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before also this fact that we feel quite uncomfortable with silence, with pauses, um, and I'm wondering why that is the case. I recently experienced that myself. I had a whole afternoon free, so I didn't have any meetings, anything. And after lunch, I became really stressed because there was nothing to do really. And I really felt that this became uncomfortable to me. Until at some point I just said, okay, I'll go to the park. I'll have just a random walk, not jogging, not efficiency-led activity, in order to enhance my health or something. Just walking in the park with no reason.
Yeah.
And then I started, listening to birds and seeing, some fish in the water. And I realized, man, like that's the real life. So
Mm.
that's the real life. All the things that I did before is nice, is work, it's calls, meetings. But I was so astonished because I was so stressed of doing nothing. But the doing nothing is what made me see what is actually going on. Like that's birds flying, water, sun. That was what I was afraid of, kind of. And I wanted to go back, to have meetings, to do things, and um, and that connected to me so well to your book about this importance of pausing, that for me is so hard to start, but then when you're doing it, you realize the benefit of it.
Mm.
But to
Yeah.
start pausing, I think that's such a challenging step.
It is. I think I think that it used to come with the territory, right? So when most human beings farmed, you can't hurry the rain. You know, it
Mm,
rains when it rains. You are forced. I still have neighbors in Spain who largely do live off the land, and it's very interesting how present that is with them. And I think so. I think that this sense of kind of hurry and rush, it's hundreds of years old. You know, Goethe was lamenting the pace of life, as was Nietzsche. You know, in centuries past. And so I think it mostly comes with industrialization. And effectively, one way of thinking of it is we've sort of unwittingly turned ourselves into machines, that we've designed a machine-driven world that humans have to fit into instead of a kind of human-centered world into which machines can act to support. And I've not thought of this before, but I wonder whether with the latest round of technology with AI, maybe there's the possibility of shifting that. But anyway, since the Industrial Revolution up until now, we measure productivity. That's what machines do. As many pieces per minute as can be manufactured. That's the sort of philosophical bedrock, if you like. And so we've fit ourselves into that. And whereas before in an agricultural world, a goat herd on a mountain had plenty of time to contemplate everything, even whilst looking after his goats. That's kind
mm,
of disappeared and receded in our everyday experience, and we miss it because we're still we have that organic form and that need. So you're absolutely right. It's very hard to begin. I thought long and hard about that in the book. How do you help people begin? And in the end, I think there is no easy way. You've got to want to. So you've got to notice and you've got to do it for yourself. Nobody can do it for you. Once you do it, then there's lots of tricks and techniques and tools and ways you can go about it, different frequencies, lengths, all sorts of things from think weeks like Bill Gates used to do, to Stefan Sagmeister taking a sabbatical year from his design business, to stopping before you walk through a door, like monks do when they enter a Zendo. So there's all sorts of things you can do. But you're right to identify that point of starting is you got to want to, and you got to have that lived experience you have of, oh, when I did, it was worth it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think the other way is to start to actually notice and feel the pain and discomfort of the incessant activity and to start to be honest and recognize. So, why do we resist emptying?
Hmm.
Well, because when we empty our space of tasks that feel like they make our lives meaningful, we have to ask ourselves, is it meaningful? Who am I? Do I matter? Is what I'm doing worth doing? So we have to ask ourselves really good, really difficult questions. And so it's just easier not to. So one of the reasons we stay busy is because busyness is actually a form of laziness. It stops us having to think about the hard stuff.
Hmm.
The other thing in conversation is, as I say in that book, if there's no silence, there's no conversation. So, in the midst of conversation, if people aren't pausing, even just for a moment or two, to hear themselves speak, to choose their words more carefully, or to think about what the other person's just said properly, rather than
Hmm.
just wheel out the immediate response, then we're not really conversing in the way we might. We're just sort of
Hmm.
flapping our mouths at each other. And so I think this all speaks to, a machine. My father was an aeronautical engineer, and the thing about aero engines is they work incredibly well when they work uniformly. They spin at the same speed, they run at the same revs, the gases flow through them at the same speed. That's what machines like. We don't. We like light and shade, night and day, warm and cold, variegation, variety, difference. And and part of that rhythmically is to have variation in the
Hmm.
rhythm of our days, hours, weeks, months, and our life overall. And without it, life quite literally becomes kind of flat, you know.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I think that in order to start realizing that, you have to have, it's a kind of catch-22, really. You have to be able to pause in order to notice that you need to pause so there's no magic answers to that. But I think feeling the pain and being willing to try something out, what I do think is really important is to try and on a small scale, right?
Hmm.
Like 5 minutes a day. Or it was a lovely story. A guy he was the CEO of the University of Oxford Technology Transfer Company, and he just used to play himself. Funnily enough, he used to take five at the end of the day. So he'd close down his computer and spend 5 minutes in his office before he left work in order to leave work at work. And getting home 5 minutes earlier wasn't, critical.
Hmm.
People say, well, I don't have time for that. I need to get home. You go, 5 minutes, really?
And
Uh,
what is he doing in his 5 minutes?
Nothing.
Just sitting.
Just sitting.
Hmm.
And when I spoke to him about it, I asked him the same question. He said, well, sometimes I'll be daydreaming. Yeah, sometimes I'll think, oh my God, I forgot to do that. And he'd write a note. Sometimes he'd be thinking about the home he was going to and the people he was going to meet. Sometimes he might be thinking about the traffic. But much like you in the park, he wasn't addressing a task. He wasn't sort of saying, I'll use that 5 minutes too. He was just sitting there seeing what came. But the other
Hmm.
thing he was doing was listening to music, because what he would habitually do, it was kind of joke for himself. He went, oh, I'm going to take five. So he put on the jazz track, Take Five by Dave
Hmm.
Brubeck, which weirdly, the original version of is 5 minutes and 8 seconds long.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, I'm sure after a while he'd vary the music, but it was just that idea of even a tiny bit of practice like that can be a way to start.
Hmm.
And then notice how you feel. Does that work for me? Oh, actually, no, it's driving me nuts. Or I can't stand Dave Brubeck, so change the music. Or do it at the
Hmm.
beginning of the day instead of the end. Do it at lunchtime.
Hmm.
Do it. And again, to be playful with trying out how pause works for you, because you won't do that if you don't recognize that it matters in the first place. So in
Yeah.
the end, it does come down to that, do you want this? Do you want to do
Hmm.
this? Does it matter to
Hmm.
you?
Hmm.
And then if the answer to that is no, then the honest thing to do is to own it rather than kind of go, oh yeah, no, I don't have time. You go, no, 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 no. You've chosen not to.
Mhm.
It's a legitimate
Yeah,
choice, but don't kid yourself that you are the one person in the world who has no opportunity whatsoever to do this.
yeah,
Everybody can tell themselves they've got their story that says, I don't have time for that. You go, oh,
yeah,
really? You don't have
yeah.
3 seconds. You don't have
Mhm.
5 minutes. Okay.
Mhm. And I think maybe as a last question that comes to my mind also, or listening to you, um, there's a lot of discussion around mindfulness at work, and the mindfulness MBSR and all of these movements who came really into the business world as well, right? To use mindfulness as a tool to enhance performance. And I
Mm.
think that's where for me the risk lies in that. Um, I love this book. Maybe you know it as well. It's called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, where it really becomes clear. Like if you're into mindfulness meditation, you do it just for its own sake. You don't do it for something else. You don't pause in order to then work more or better. It's you pause to have a pause. That's it. And
Mm.
I'm curious if you also see it that way. If pausing is like a performance enhancing tool, or if we should do it just to pause without any,
Yeah.
motivation behind it.
So I think that is a real risk. I think I basically agree with you. I think the only riff I would add is that uh, so instrumentalization, as I would call it, doing this to get that,
Hmm.
is to miss the point. But the paradox, and I do think paradox is the way of the world, and I think paradox is different from contradiction. Contradiction is two things which kind of negate each other. Paradox is two opposites in relationship, and so paradox is the way of the world because there's always the dynamics that are created by two things pulling in different directions. And so the paradox here is that if you pause for its own sake, you may find in indirect or oblique ways that it does enhance your performance
Hmm.
in some ways, quite
Hmm.
possibly ways you didn't anticipate or expect. And that bit is crucial because if you pause in order to, it's almost like to me, it helps to sort of imagine some omniscient being, some people maybe this is their idea of God, so they don't have to imagine it, but for me, I'm not religious. But like the universe kind of says, oh no, 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 no. You can't trick me. You can't tell me that you're going to be more productive by pausing. No, I'm not going to have that. But if you really commit to this thing in and of for its own sake, then then there might be this thing over here that you get to gain. But almost
Hmm.
certainly it's going to be something that you didn't imagine you wanted or needed. So actually it's a better gain because it's not limited by what you think you want, you know.
Hmm.
So just to put, this all sounds very abstract, but just to make it concrete, a senior leader I worked with at Oxford really struggled with this idea because he ran a global family business. But he ran it as if it was still the culture and habits of that place. It was run as if it was still a small family bakery in the 16th arrondissement in Paris. And this was just a kind of, real tension. And so it was enormously difficult for him to take the time out to accept an invitation to go to Wimbledon to watch the tennis. But he did. And he was kind of gritting his teeth the whole time. And while he was at Wimbledon watching the tennis, he met someone else from another business who'd also gone along, because he was invited by one of his clients or something, and who'd done a huge amount of business in Russia, which was the biggest, thorniest business issue he had at the time, was how to do business in Russia. This was about 15 years ago. Uh, and so he learned a huge amount from this person that he wouldn't have met if he'd been
Hmm.
chasing the goal. Now, you can't guarantee that. That's not the way these things happen. But you know for sure that if you never do it, it's never going to happen. Not
Hmm.
that or any number of myriad other possibilities that could, in an oblique or tangential way, absolutely transform your life or your work.
Mm.
So, and then it takes us back to biology. That's random mutation, right? That's requisite variety. That's where variation comes in order to kind of leaven or change something and transform and create something new, you know. And if you're just chasing, on the treadmill, chasing the goals, where's that coming from? It might be right there in front of you, but you don't have the headspace to even notice. You look at the history of scientific discovery or creative inspiration for that matter, and almost always it happens in a break or a pause or in the bath, in the famous Archimedean example, eureka moments. And all the people that write about this, they're very clear, I think. There's a very clear pattern. It's not that it happens in the bath. It's not you spend your life in the bath and you'll have great ideas. It's that while you're doing something else, or while you're disconnected from the problem itself,
Mhm.
other parts of your psyche, the undermind, as Ben Claxton brilliantly calls it, are kind of busy playing around, actually, you know,
Mm.
and that's the value of dreams as well. Like, I mean, apparently the story about Paul McCartney and Yesterday is that he dreamt it, and when he woke up, he thought, oh God, I've heard this amazing song. I don't know where I've heard it. And he went and played it to the other Beatles, and they kind of went, never heard that before. What is it? And he went, I don't know. And it turned out he'd composed it in a dream,
Wow.
and thought he'd overheard it somewhere. I don't know if that story is true, but I've heard it told. And so yeah, so that kind of the margins, the liminal spaces, the edges, and in temporal terms, that's what pauses allow the possibility of. But to go back to your original question, if you do it in order to, then you've misunderstood because that's just not the way it works.
Mm. Maybe it's a good moment for us to do a pause as well.
Sure.
It was really amazing to talk to you, to have a conversation about conversation. I think it was really a great one. Thank you so much for your time, Robert. It was really a pleasure.
Well, I know, and thanks for you. I mean, I kind of describe listening as the habitat of conversation, in the same way that trees are the habitat of birds. And what's really interesting about this, much of what I've said today are things I've written about or spoken about or thought before, and much of it isn't.
Hmm.
Much of it's new, which is arising as a function of what I see you interested in, or commenting, or listening to, or asking about, or coming alive to, And I think that's a sign for me of it being a good conversation. And whoever listens to this can be their own judge of that. But for me, to echo the last point, that in and of itself is enough. I didn't. This conversation was a conversation for its own sake. And
Mhm.
I'm sure something will come of it. I've got no idea what. We'll wait and see.
Yeah, let's see. Thank you so much, Robert.
Fantastic. Thank you.